So good afternoon once again. My name is Brenda Lee, and I'm president of Greater Newark Alliance of Black School Educators. I'm also an educator in the city of Newark, the great city of Newark. Yes, go ahead, give it up for Newark. And for those who don't know, the great mayor of the great city of Newark will be our keynote tomorrow. So if you didn't plan on coming back, you should probably come back. Yeah, all right. East Orange in the house as well. Okay, we're shouting everybody out. Needless to say, it is clearly an honor. I'm just going to ask that we are actually going to get started. Tony? Thank you. We're going to get started. So if you're not here for the workshop, which is School Discipline Disparities in New Jersey, a New Look, please transition to either the auditorium or the 6th floor. Thank you. Can we shout out Diane Colson real quick, though? Diane Colson, raise your hand, please. She's shaking her head no. I just want to acknowledge Diane in this moment because we have done this work, and Diane, you are appreciated. Thank you. All right. Oh, go ahead. Give it up for her. Thank you. So today, we're here to take a deep dive in a study by a man, Dr. Charles Payne. If you ever met Dr. Payne, he'll immediately say to you, please call me Charles. However, it's hard for me to just call him Charles. If you could just open your programs, please, just so you have a sense of who he is, his accomplishments, the work he has done in Newark, at Rutgers, and also the work he did in Chicago. So I am going to pivot for everyone to introduce themselves. However, this conversation is important because we recognize that school discipline impacts the school to prison pipeline, and this work that I'm very personally committed to. I'm also trained for restorative practices, and it's certainly a mindset shift, and we're here to dig into this study. I also did a study, you probably didn't hear about it. It was entitled, Dr. Payne, Restorative Practices Begin Where Zero Tolerance Ends. Yes. Thank you so much. Needless to say, thank you, Dr. Payne, for being here, and his colleague, Dr. Vandine Campbell, and the work you've done. And you've already been introduced to Dr. Sasha Campbell. This is her home. She has opened her home to us. Can we give it up to her, please? Gray, thank you, Dr. Gray. In addition to that, we also want to acknowledge the great president of this university, Dr. Ripollette, the work that he has done throughout the state, the work that he has done here at Kane, and how, I'm sure throughout this experience, Dr. Gray, you're going to speak to some of the work that's happening here and some of the commitment that Kane University has made to impact primarily our community. It's so exciting. So without any further delay, I'm going to pivot for each doctor to introduce themselves, speak a little bit about who they are, how does this work impact them, and then we'll take the deep dive into the look. Dr. Payne. Okay,
well, I have probably already been sufficiently introduced, but I'm Charles Payne. This is my 4th year as director of the Cornwall Research Center at Rutgers Newark. Cornwall's mission is to use research to improve the quality of life in urban New Jersey. And I would say that our wheelhouse, what we do really in some depth is education, and how do we improve educational systems. I've been studying education and the civil rights movement for pretty close to 50 years now, right? Somewhere in the back of the mid-60s.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vandine Campbell. I am an assistant research professor at Rutgers University in Newark, and I spend most of my time at the Cornwall Center. In a nutshell, I will say that for the past 2 or so years, I have been scouring New Jersey's data, trying to capture various dimensions of inequities in education, particularly focusing on the transition from middle school to high school and high school to college. So Many of you might have met Ashley, who was running our table. You will have seen some of the reports that we have there. Those reports are just a few of many that will be coming out, really painting a portrait of the state of education in New Jersey and where there are disparities. And hopefully those reports can really start a conversation about strategies for closing the gaps. Thank you.
Good afternoon. As was shared, my name is Dr. Sancha Gray. I am very blessed to lead a division that was created by our president here of Kean University, Dr. Lamont Repollet. The division that I lead is called Entrepreneurial Education Initiatives. It was the president's vision to create a pipeline into Kean University by being very intentional and strategic in engaging in the pre-K to 12 space so that we look at education along a continuum of pre-K, meaning age 3, up into doctoral studies at the university. I'm blessed to be accompanied by my colleagues, Senior Vice President Joseph Youngblood and Barbara George Johnson, JD, who have been extremely influential in informing me and ensuring that Kean University had a place on this panel. They are engaged in excellent work through the John S. Watson Institute, and I'm very delighted as a former superintendent, a former building administrator, former classroom teacher, and former substitute teacher to speak along with my colleagues here on the panel from a practitioner's lens, but also underscoring and highlighting the work that policy needs to be involved in to effectuate the changes that we are going to talk about. So thank you for having me.
Yes, sir.
Well, good afternoon. Thank everyone for being here. More than that, thank you for being concerned. I was just about to roll. I didn't know you were stolen it.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let's try again. Some of you who are sitting in the back may want to move up some. The slides we have came out a little light in the printing. There are a couple of printouts on some of the tables, and if you want, there are more printouts at our table upstairs. Van Deen and I are engaged in a relatively large project to understand equity and effectiveness in New Jersey schools. Who gets what out of these school systems, right? For whom are these systems working, and how can they be improved? When I say that we are a team, I mean we have a wonderful division of labor. She does all the work, and I get all the credit. Right? I mean, it's one of the best jobs I've ever had, I'll tell you. Van Deen's done a remarkable, when I came to New Jersey, I used to say, any information you want about New Jersey is available somewhere on the web. But they store it in places where you can't get at it, and you can't put information together in ways that tell a story. So what she's doing is taking some of these disparate data sources and putting them together in ways that will help people answer the questions that they want answered, right? So again, it's a large project, but one part of it is how do you move toward environments that feel safe and supportive for every child, right? How do you move toward environments which put a real priority on the flourishing of all children? And one part of that question is, how do we get rid of harsh discipline, right? How do we get rid of exclusionary discipline? Get rid of reduced to the absolute minimum, exclusionary discipline, discipline that takes kids out of classes, or the most destructive form, discipline that puts them out of school altogether, right? And so we're at the beginning of looking at that. Some of the data you're going to see today, no one has ever seen but you. We didn't see it, and some of these tables came off like Thursday or Friday night within the last week. So we hope you'll find it interesting. It's only the beginning of a larger discussion, and we hope that some of you will want to be involved in the longer discussion. So I will start off by saying a few things about what we know about the national data, which is going to look bad to you, right? And some of you already know it, right? So that's going to look bad. Then Vandine will come on and she'll do a deeper dive into New Jersey data on discipline patterns and discipline disparities. The short lesson is New Jersey is worse than the nation, right? And the nation ain't doing well, right? So we will do that in some detail. So I don't have to say a whole lot, I think, to this audience about why we're having this discussion, why it matters. I think everybody has a general sense that I think the single most important thing for me about this is when we put kids out of school, we're telling those kids something. We're giving those kids a message about what we think about them. We're giving them a message that they're not good enough to be a part of us, right? You know, one of the themes for this meeting is faith. I think the message that kids get from being put out of school, nobody has faith in me, right? That's gonna have consequences, right? It has the consequences in terms of lost instructional time, lower school performance, decreased student engagement, reduced graduation rates, mental health and social-emotional problems, and increased likelihood of contact with the judicial system, the school-to-prison pipeline that Brenda referred to a moment ago. So that's why we are here. Those are the consequences, right, that we're trying to ameliorate. And so if you look at the nation, one of the things, actually I can't even read this printout. If you look at the nation, the familiar story, who gets the most of this stuff? Boys of color, black or Latinx. Disabled students. I don't know if people are as clear on how strong the data on disabled students are, how disadvantaged they are, I mean. Preschool students, which may catch you off guard, right? But there are significant disparities in preschool and by race. And of course, it's a high school problem. So, one of the important points is that we know, based on some really strong data, that if black and Hispanic kids on the one hand, white kids on the other do exactly the same thing, they're going to get different kinds of punishments, right? This chart does not say, and I realized this morning that we left it off, that it should have said that we also know that different kids get punished for different kinds of things. For black and Hispanic kids, it tends to be subjective offensive. That child was defiant. That child has a bad attitude. For white kids, it tends to be something objective. He hit somebody. He cheated on a test, right? So it's different kinds of things that different kinds of kids are being called to account for. And that when you talk to kids in school, the kids know that there are disparities in the way in which different kinds of, that some kids get away with things and some kids don't, and they know it's racially patterned. They interpret that in different ways. But both white kids and non-white kids agree that there's a racial game going on here, right? For whatever reasons. I am absolutely doing this wrong. Of course, the disparities start very early. So if you're looking at preschool, and we're talking about 3- and 4-year-old children, right? Black preschool students are 18% of the population. But if you look at out-of-school suspensions, you're talking about 3- and 4-year-olds now, right? Some really bad ones out there. You know, you got to keep an eye on these average 4-year-olds. 18% of the population, but they're getting 43% of all school suspensions, right? At that age, right? That almost has to, in my mind, have to be some kind of adultification. Somebody's not looking at a child as a child, right? And they're responding in ways that would be appropriate, maybe if they were older. So across the country, black students, now we're now talking about K to 12, 15% of all enrolled students, 38% of all students who've received out-of-school suspension. Girls, about 7.5% of the student population. Black girls, I'm sorry, getting 13% of all out-of-school suspensions. Now note this point and hold on to it for a second, because we'll come back to it in the New Jersey context, right? Latinx students, 27% of the national student body now, but relatively low, only 21% of out-of-school suspensions, right? So it's lower than the share of the population. But watch how that changes as we walk through the data. I'm supposed to say something else there. Oh, there we go. And again, to stress the point about disabled students, 13% of the student enrollment nationally, but 25% of out-of-school suspension. And is that all I had to do? So we'll now turn it over to Vandine to talk about how some of the same issues and some additional issues look when we look at the data for New Jersey.
Okay, so my next few slides will go through quite a few charts and tables, but I'll try to highlight the key point that we're focusing on today. Take a look at these numbers. We'll come back to them a little bit later. But the point here is that when looking at the overall suspension rate statewide, all students, they seem quite low. Any suspension, 4%. Out-of-school suspensions, 2.7%. The remaining slides will kind of break that down by student subgroups and different types of schools, and then we'll see where the disproportions and disparities really show up once we dig deeper into these numbers. Footnote, I've gotten used to presenting on Zoom, getting that used to presenting in person. All right, so the first set of slides will show you data that are reported nationally. And I should note that we do see some differences in how the data are reported nationally by the Civil Rights Data Collection and how they're reported in the state, with the national data trending a little bit higher than how the state reports these data. I think that's an important caveat just to note for you. But on these slides, what we're looking at is a disproportion between boys and girls of different racial groups in terms of how they are represented in the school-age population or the population of students enrolled, relative to how they are represented among students receiving one or more out-of-school suspensions. So take a look at some of those highlighted cells. Black boys, for example, are represented 4 times their share of their enrollment in the population. Looking at Hispanic boys and thinking of what Dr. Payne said a little bit earlier, we see that whereas nationally, right, their share of suspensions are lower than their share of the population, here in New Jersey, their share of suspensions are greater than their share of all enrolled students, though not quite as large as it is for black boys. Take a look at the numbers for black girls down in the second panel. They are represented among students receiving out-of-school suspensions 2 times their share of all students enrolled. So a question that we've grappled with quite a bit at the center, what does this mean for instructional time, for the educational experiences? And part of what we try to do in this chart is to show the numbers in a way that can really capture some of that, right? So here we're looking at school days missed due to out-of-school suspensions. I've highlighted 2 cells here, the number for black boys and black girls. We can read these numbers as follows, looking at the rightmost column. For every 100 black boy enrolled, there are 55 days missed due to out-of-school suspensions. If we track down the first panel of the table and we see the numbers for other racial groups among boys, we see that's huge difference, right? For black boys, at minimum twice as much or more than twice as much as any other group here. For every 100 black girls enrolled in New Jersey, there are 31 days missed, 31 days of school missed due to out-of-school suspensions. Again, track down that column, not even close to the number for any other racial group among girls. Okay, here we look a little bit at the intersection of English learners and students with disabilities, and we'll come back to this point again. But stark disparity or disproportion among boys with disability relative to their share of students enrolled. And for that matter, the same is true for all disabled students, right? If we look at the bottommost cell, 19% of the enrolled population, 35% of students receiving one or more out-of-school suspensions. So here, you might not be able to see it, but we want to talk a little bit about what we're seeing as the possibility.
Yeah, I better stand here. I've been particularly concerned with learning from what we used to call the Abbott districts in New Jersey, the lower income districts. And in this chart, we're trying to ask the question about some of the larger Abbotts that have to have at least 5,000 students. And I think we use a cutoff point of at least 50% low-income students, free or reduced lunch, right? One of the points that I want to make is that in terms of popular stereotype, when you say large urban low-income school, that's where people say you gotta suspend some of those kids. There are a lot of bad acting kids in those schools, right? You have no choice. You gotta do it, right? I think that is a very, very common kind of a perception. That's not the reality of these schools, right? Sort of the first thing that stands out for me in this data is that if you look at, let's say, out-of-school suspension for the state, as Van Deen said a moment ago, it's just about 3%. Look how much that varies, though, across these districts, all of which have significant low-income populations, all of which have some of the usual urban problems. So the variation, New Brunswick, Newark, no, I'm doing that backwards. I better read this off the chart so I don't call it right. So if you have 3% and statewide, Bridgeton, East Orange, a double, Irvington, more than double the state average. But what's really interesting for me, the number of urban districts that are below state average in their out-of-school suspensions. And it's not one or two, it's several of them, right? So it's Camden, Jersey, well, that's another category.
Hop in here and help you out. Jersey City,
Thank you.
New Brunswick, Newark, Orange, Patterson, and Union City, all below the state average.
Well below. And Plainfield, you skipped Plainfield.
Oh, sorry,
There
Plainfield.
might be somebody here in Plainfield.
Sorry, Mayor, my bad.
Oh, my goodness. The question that it raises, right? If they don't have to do it, why do the other schools have to do it so much, right?
Dr. Payne, sorry to interject, but I would be remiss to say Plainfield is actually reporting 0%.
There are a couple of zeros up there, right? Plainfield, Orange is 0. And again, as researchers, we're always suspicious of extreme numbers. So now we'll go out and ask somebody in Plainfield and Orange, is that really what you meant to report? But right now, we have decent reason to believe this is going to be close to the truth. And it makes the point that this is not, exclusionary discipline is not carved in stone for black and brown children. It's not the only way to make a school system work. And now here's something else, and I get beat up for this sometime. By all the usual districts, all the usual criteria, Union is one of the highest performing districts in the state for low-income children. The low-income children are about 87% low income in this district. I didn't put it up here, but if you look at the percent of kids who are at or above state standards in reading, percent of kids going to college, percent of kids filling out the FAFSA, Union in all of those categories challenges state standards, right? It is a really strong district in terms of what's happening academically for children. Now here's the kicker, right? And they are not putting kids out, right? Here's the kicker. One of the other strong districts for low-income children is Elizabeth, right? And if you look at Elizabeth, where is Elizabeth?
They're 5% out of school
5%,
suspension,
right?
above the state.
So they're doubling the state, not just above it, right? If you look at this in another way, how many days of instruction per 100 students are being missed, Elizabeth is also on the bad list, right? So Elizabeth...
Little under 7,000.
No, we're down to the bottom line. For every 100 students, Elizabeth misses 24 days, right? Whereas in Union, for every 100 students, Brenda?
Oh, okay.
You're going to work for
I guess
me,
I
Jeff.
started it now. Okay. 2.9%. 2.9 days, should I say.
Dang, these are two academically strong districts, right? Right? And this huge gap in how much time they're putting kids out. Now, I don't know this, and this is the kind of thing we'll be trying to find out this year. But we have no doubt that in the normal case, suspension hurts kids. But every case ain't the normal case, right? The other thing that you have to say, and some of you educators can speak to this, the way you do suspension in one school isn't the way you do suspension in another school, right? In some schools, a child may be suspended, but the counselor calls the child in the morning, the English teacher calls the child in the afternoon, somebody checks to make sure the child is not running the street and is following the assignments. That's how some districts do suspension. Another district, you on the streets, you just do what you want to do. That's suspension, right? So...
Dr. Payne, I'm reading someone's mind, and it's important. This is good information, and you'll have the report, but part of this experience is for us to be able to engage someone interactive. So what I know someone is asking is, but this data is actually based on the reporting from the school. Right. How can we say that it's accurate? What are the safeguards there around accuracy since you're self-reporting?
Well, there's self-reporting data that's going to go on the New Jersey Department of Education annual reports. So that means that data is available and can be checked by anybody. The data is also going to be fed into various compliance issues that every school district has to speak to. So on the one hand, you can be absolutely certain some of the data is wrong just because of human error. We find mistakes each and every week, one. But systematic cheating, so far as we can find, is relatively rare because the penalties for cheating would be the end of somebody's career, right? People do not want to get caught having falsified the data. But human error, that's another problem.
And I think what would also be impactful, because you spoke to it, is if we have the actual achievement data for these different districts and just kind of look at that comparison, because at the root of what you're reporting here is suspensions impact students' time in school, which then impacts student learning, which then should impact student achievement, right?
Although I would say exactly the same thing. The areas that we find in all other kinds of data, we also find in the achievement data. So again, we think it is basically right, but we know there are areas at particular points. But the 2 points that I wanted to make on this slide, one, there's wide variation across districts in the way in which they're handling exclusionary
few more.
discipline.
I can stop at any point.
And two, some of the strongest and some of the weakest districts academically are doing different things,
Okay.
right?
Do people misreport? Because we
Yes.
I'm not going to show my slides.
Go ahead.
I'm just going to put my title slide up.
When you suspend the kids feel that, oh, they don't care. You understand?
Right.
So, don't you think it would be good, rather than to suspend the kids, so come summer, when the school is out,
One moment, ma'am,
go to school?
so we can all hear you.
For every day that you think a child should be suspended, okay? So now, June 19th, school's out. These kids that you seem to think should be suspended, make them go to school, maybe if you say they need 5-day suspension, 6 days or 10 days, make them do it in the summer. And at least you have them one-on-one, and maybe you could communicate better with them. Because suspension, oh, these kids, sometimes they do things so they can get suspended.
I have seen that.
So keep them in school. What you think? Am I saying the wrong thing?
No, nothing's the wrong thing, right? We're all trying to. I am.
Because you got to come up with some kind of solution.
No question. I tend to not like solutions that use learning as punishment, right? I mean, I don't want kids to ever think, you got to go to school because you've been bad.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that just, I think, sends an absolute wrong message. The kinds of solutions that I tend to, somebody was talking about restorative justice?
Restorative practices.
Restorative practice, no. Well, restorative practice,
Yeah.
all right. That's a hard thing to make work, but when it works, it's remarkable. It's just remarkable the difference it can make. And why is it so hard to make to work? I think, and there's some evidence for this position, because it rests on a set of assumptions about kids that not all educators share.
Right.
It rests on the idea that if you engage kids in conversation long enough, you can get them to re-examine their own behavior, and therefore the change will come from inside them. And if it comes from inside them, that's permanent change, as opposed to change that comes from a punishment. Not all educators believe that about the kids that we are talking about. And if they don't believe that, before you can do restorative practice well, you got to get inside the heads of the teachers, right? And that is not
Easy.
an easy thing to do. Wait, before we do this, because there are other questions.
Go ahead, sir.
Vandine, you've got like 3 or 4 more
Yeah,
slides.
yeah.
Why don't we do that? Because I want to put as much data out there as possible, and then we'll go right to questions.
And we'll also have,
A question at the table back there.
yes, sir, I'll definitely get to it. We also want to hear from the esteemed Dr. Sasha Gray, because she was superintendent in Asbury. And so although she's here leading the next phase of her work, she's a wealth of information. So we want to get to her and have her speak to this. Then we'll open up for more dialogue.
Sounds good. So let me run through these quickly. The slide on the screen, the simple point is that we do see some evidence that, some districts rely a little bit more on exclusionary practices than others, and there's some concentration, we would say, in South Jersey a little bit, Northeast, but this is a theme that we're still exploring, but based on the data that we've analyzed, this is how the map is looking. We've also done quite a bit of work to understand this issue via the lens of segregation. So what are we observing in schools that are segregated racially and economically? And so we've done some work to categorize schools in the state, particularly high schools, because as Dr. Payne said earlier, we're noticing that a good amount of the issue with suspension is at the high school level. So we've done some work to categorize schools and look at differences in suspension rates between different types of schools. And so much of what we'll talk about will focus on schools that are segregated by race and socioeconomic status as compared to schools that are more mixed on both dimensions. So in the beginning, I asked to hold the statewide segregation numbers, suspension rates, only to point out, bottom right, that in schools that are what we might call the most segregated in the state, the suspension rate, the out-of-school suspension rate is close to 10% compared to that overall statewide number, which I think is about 3-point-something%. Sorry. And this chart really just shares the same information graphically. We've looked as well on the intersection between segregation and composition of, or the proportion of students in the school with disabilities or with English language learner status. And we're finding that when you intersect those two, the rates really just get that much higher. So in schools with the highest proportions of students with disabilities, you'll notice that the out-of-school suspension rate is just about 13%, some of the highest rates that we've seen in the data. So I'll just rest it there in terms of the numbers and leave it up to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. We know you have questions, we'll definitely engage you in those.
So good afternoon. I'm going to be a little more conversational in nature because a lot of data was already shared. In academia, we talk about theoretical frameworks. So my theoretical framework is going to rest, and I'm going to talk a little bit more to you about it as I unpack the vision for this division and my colleagues' division. It rests on Proverbs 16:27, which is the inspiration behind a saying we've all heard. My grandmother used to say it all the time, an idle mind is devil's workshop. And why do I say that? I say that because we have to give children something to do, particularly black and brown children. And when they don't have things to do that engage their intellectual curiosity, then we begin to see some of what has occurred in this data that's been presented. There's also another issue there are several issues at hand, which is why the work of policy is so important. And the work of policy is so important because it's the policies that need to be amended so that there is that flexibility in terms of how we view and look at the way we are treating our youth, particularly black and brown children and especially males that was underscored in this work. It is the adultification. What is the difference when Johnny at 3 kicks someone compared to when Jamal kicks someone at 3? Big difference. Because if Jamal and Javier are sat in front of the administrator, oftentimes the parents and the families receive calls because Johnny's kick is different than Jamal and Javier's kick. There's a mindset that goes along with that, and we just heard from the research why that occurs, and that is specifically the referencing of adultification. This idea that Jamal and Javier should think differently about the kick. And so what do we do about that? How do we address that? Well, a few ways that we are looking at that through our president's creation of this division, as well as the other newer division on campus through the John Watson Institute, as well as entrepreneurial education initiatives. We want to give students things to do. We want to equip the educators and everyone in the eco-space, meaning the families, the caregivers. We want to equip them with strategies and a mindset that understands A, what's happening, which is why this research is so valuable, and B, when you're in those spaces and places, what are those things that you can say and do to be advocates on behalf of children? The programs and partnerships that we provide students before school, after school, and on the weekends critically important. Policies around how to support that. Making sure that we're going out to vote so that those interests are upheld, so that we have people in places and spaces that do that. We're very fortunate here with our president, former Commissioner of Education, who started the work, and we have the Commissioner of Education today, Dr. Angelica McMillan Allen, who is spearheading that, the cultural mismatch, if you will, of educators in the classroom, in the school space, based on the students that they serve. There is a significant challenge there. We find oftentimes that black and brown children go to school and never have a black or brown educator or an administrator. There's a cultural nuance that's missing there. We understand Jamal's kick is a 3-year-old's kick. It's not different than Johnny's 3-year-old kick. But when you don't have the representation in the classroom, you begin to see different things like the data has uncovered begin to unfold. And so one of the policy issues that's on the table right now is with regard to ensuring that we create a pipeline. Our president of this university was very instrumental in spearheading that work when he was the commissioner, of ensuring that we bring more educators of color into the state of New Jersey, and it starts with the policy issues that keep us out. One of the policy issues is how are they available and accessible for teacher certification programs? When you look at most universities, teacher certification programs at the undergraduate level do not reflect black and brown educators, potential future educators. So already we're starting behind the goal line in that regard. This division was created specifically to ensure that all students have access, especially black and brown students, in the pre-K to 12 space, to be able to effectuate that kind of change, so that we are also giving them something to do. We have dual college programs where we're starting students in college while they're in high school. And these are oftentimes the partnerships that I'm speaking to you about, where students are taking college-level courses. They receive a Kane University ID. They are Kane students. It starts as soon as they graduate the 8th grade. And they are some of the districts that have been represented in this data that are partners here, because we fundamentally understand as practitioners what has to happen. We have to give them something to do. When we don't give them something to do, they make up their own activities. And those are typically activities we don't want them engaging in. So that's key. We also know that it's critically important from a policy standpoint to make sure that we put representation in those classrooms. And so the practice around having practitioners, for student teachers to spend a year in the classroom. You may not be aware of this, but the practice has been, if you're in a traditional education program, you go into student teaching. That student teaching experience requires you to literally work for 2 semesters or more and not get paid. That's your practicum experience. Well, I don't know many black and brown students that can afford to work and not get paid. I was one of them. I was a working mother and a working wife. There was no way I was able to do that. Fortunately, the provision for me was the alternate route. This requirement has now been relaxed. There's policy out that is relaxing those requirements so that we can have the representation that we need. And the other point that I want to underscore is the mindset. I've had an opportunity to see some of the beginnings of when we start talking about restorative practices, it is a process. This is not something that happens overnight. I'm delighted to be in the room with William Davis. He was my first introduction to positive supports in schools. And as Dr. Payne shared, there's a mindset still from educators where they're not necessarily comfortable with the notion of what they call rewarding students to do what they are supposed to do. And so he's led a lot of work across the state in terms of educating educators on that mind shift that has to change. And so one of the things that I hope comes out of this conversation is that you've receive the data, you understand from a practitioner standpoint some of the reasons why we are where we are, but then you also can understand what we need to do to advance this conversation. It's not enough to say these are the problems, but what we must say is what are the solutions? The solutions are, now that we know what is occurring, we have to engage collectively in this mind shift that needs to occur so that we are not supporting and perpetuating the adultification of Black and brown children. We have to say it's not enough that our voices weren't heard and run away and not vote. We cannot perpetuate that narrative. We have to vote and hold those people that create policy, approve policy, accountable to making sure that happens. And we do that by being informed and educated. I know there's so much more that I can say, but Brenda Lee, thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to now move over and we can engage in our question and answer.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gray. Spot on, as we would say in I am. Well said. And the great thing about this experience is we have the data, but then we also have the brilliance of what's occurring in Kane, and which can occur in schools everywhere. And so at this point, I just want to transition for questions. Any questions, any feedback, any thoughts? Show me, Dr. Payne, who?
No, you okay now?
Okay, I see someone right here. Thank you. And if you could just introduce yourself and who you're representing.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marilyn Chambers. We came up from Atlantic City, New Jersey. Who do we represent? We represent the citizens of Atlantic City, New Jersey. That's who we are. But I have two questions, if you don't mind. Are you at liberty to say in which counties there is most discrimination between Black and Browns expelling from schools?
We can do it. And it's on. So if you say the disparity is 3 times greater in New Jersey across the, I keep forgetting this, I'm sorry. Me and technology. So if the disparity is on average 3 times greater for Black boys than anybody else in the state of New Jersey, all right? Then that means that's an average, right? And that means that across our 21 counties, somebody's higher than that average.
Yes, but which
Somebody's
county?
low.
Okay, sorry.
And so what we intend to do is figure out county by county and school district by school district, where are the disparities largest and where are they smallest, right? But that's the next round of the work. But it's all publicly available, right? We just got to put those 2 pieces of data together.
Okay. Another question is, do you think that, I don't know how to really put this into words, but the more income in a county helps determine the decision-making?
Yeah. Yeah, but I'd put that another way for me. Schools respond to power, right? And what income means is if you put a child out of school, you know that if a child's parents at a certain financial level, you know they're going to protest. You know that, right? And so you might want to find some lesser way to deal with that that won't get you to push back. I think the problem, and I'm going to say this bluntly, nobody fights that way for too many of our kids. They don't have power behind them. Too many of our parents, and I understand the reasons. There are good reasons parents don't want to go to school. But when you don't go to school, when people know that if something happens to your child, no one's going to come up there and say, you leave our children at jeopardy, right? So I want to say, yes, money matters. This is America. But so does organization. And our communities are not organized well enough to protect many of our children. And therefore, they're vulnerable. Thank you for the question.
And I think Dr. Gray spoke about that in her ending points.
Good afternoon, everybody. I know some of y'all are a little sleepy from the food, but I hope we're going to wake up just a little bit. And the question that I have in the research that you're doing, and I want to commend the effort that's being done on the research, but I also hope that we're going to identify schools that are working and institutions that have made the transition to see our children as scholars, as young people who are actually accomplishing the things we want them to accomplish. Because at some point we need to follow the examples that are working, in addition to looking at the issues that aren't working. And so the sooner we can highlight those circumstances, then I think the easier will be for us to rally around how do we find, and the effort to increase educators of color is profoundly needed. The disparity between white teachers and children of color in the classrooms is a significant issue. But I do hope we're going to highlight some of the institutions that are making the strides we'd like to see.
And I think it is highlighted in the study. If you look at the data here, and you spoke to it earlier in the presentation, we looked at a Union City and these different schools, Plainfield. Oh, see, the mayor was looking at me like, she better say Plainfield. Okay, and Plainfield, but it's about what Dr. Gray was speaking to. We need, and also what Dr. Payne just said, we need to come together and do the work and be willing to listen and learn from those schools and those leaders that are making it happen. Oh, sure, after the mayor.
So a concern that I have, quite frankly, is that clearly one would be led to believe that there is a correlation between the suspension rates and the performance in the school district. And you pointed out that Plainfield has, what, a 0 suspension? Out of school. And so what concerns me is that I know that our Plainfield School District is not performing anywhere close to where it needs to be. I believe the graduation rate is probably about 69% or something like that. So how do you explain what appears to be a disconnect with the data and the reality of the graduation rates?
Great question.
Yeah, there's no question about there being a correlation between the two. Am I on? Can you hear me? There's no question about the fact of the correlation, but there's no one factor that explains. Maybe, oh, I can hear this one better. The correlation is there, but correlation is exactly that. It's only correlation. There's no one factor that explains achievement, and one of the things that I find hopeful in this work, and partly it's because we do spend a lot of time looking at positive outliers. We make that, almost every one of our reports is a section. These are the places where it's being done well. If you looked at academic achievement across the ABEC districts, the best ones are at the state average or above. The worst are in the teens in terms of the number of their kids who are meeting state average, at the teens, right? So that's the gap. And it's important to understand that because it means our kids don't have to fail, right? But to come back to that, right? If you then look at the positive outliers and say, what are they all doing? Many of them are doing different things, right? They are not doing it all in the same way. If for me there is one common element across many of the positive outliers that we have, whatever it is they're doing, they do it to high standards. It's not so much that the things that they do, but that they hold their adults accountable to a higher level of performance with whatever model they use.
And Mayor, if I just interject here, it also matters what's being taught in the classroom. It's nice if you're at school, right? And again, as we highlighted earlier, this is self-reporting data, okay? So I'll leave that there. But what matters is the teaching that's occurring in the classroom. We need them to be there, though, to be a part of effective teaching. And what Dr. Gray just spoke to earlier is about, you hear it right in here, culturally relevant. You've heard it. That's what we're talking about now. That's so that students can engage with you and learn. And there was the buzzword, now everybody's hand is up. Go ahead, Doc.
Just to quickly add, part of what we do in the report, as Dr. Payne just said, we do highlight what we're considering positive outliers in terms of the metric on hand. But in the discussion, part of what we do is also consider that against other metrics, as you've said, Mayor. So we look at the graduation rates, we look at the college enrollment rates, and then qualify whether we really think this is a positive outlier. The premise underneath that is to really say that even though this metric may be good, we really need to consider a range of other factors when we're looking at a particular school or a particular district. Another thing that we do in the report is kind of look at the trend, right? So we, in this, we're really trying to emphasize this positive outlier angle, but we're also looking at change in trend. So one of the things that we've done in the report is kind of look at improvement over time, and partly make a case that improvement on one metric doesn't always immediately mean improvement on another. And sometimes the metrics kind of need time to catch up together. Finally, I'll just add a plug that one of the things that we want to do this year is to do a deeper dive into at least one or two schools or districts that we see are doing well on particular metrics, and we want to understand a little bit more about the practices in those districts and see what we can learn from them. So if you want to offer up your district, we're ready.
Dr. Gray, would you like to add any thoughts? Okay.
All right. Kawana Coleman, East Orange Senior Citizen Center. My issue is the date of this right here is 2018 to 19. I'm a school teacher, and knowing that we have 3 years of pandemic, and to look at the information dealing with children being absent. In the morning at 7:45 a.m., I was on my phone calling 50 kids to get them to come onto their iPad or to whatever to be present so that the school could get the money that they're going to get for their attendance. Okay, so their absenteeism was based all on money. The white communities understand the dollar. We think we're getting free lunch, so we aren't even paying attention to the dollar and forcing our kids to come to school with a purpose to educate themselves, be able to buy a house, be able to get out there and run around. They can't be Bambi forever. Okay, so the thing is that in looking at this, the thought in my mind would be the white communities have an intrinsic value in their youth. The black community, we may love our kids and all that kind of stuff, but in understanding that is greater than just giving them food and something to wear. It's greater because they have to be our future. So we have to build into them a need to pay back into the future so that their brothers and sisters can be pulled along and pulled up. So when I think about it, I think that the state has allowed white communities to, and many of the schools, because I've been in the system, I'm certified, my SAS and all of that, to be a principal, superintendent, and all of that stuff. My choice not to do that would be that there's so much grunginess inside of the system that people can pick and choose who's going to get suspended. A principal suspension for 365 days that they're absent from school, a week. Oh, I don't like you, and you've given me a problem. You said something mean to me. So young man, you ain't never coming back in here. So those numbers get skewed some kind of way. And in the white community, they can just say, okay, I'm not going to do it. I don't want that parent to call me, or whatever it might be. So my question is, the state needs to come up with, same thing we talked about in economic parity and all of that. They need to come up with a rule so that the racism that's part and party to all those numbers that we have going, there has to be a watchdog to make sure that everybody is fairly and justly taken care of whenever an issue happens in that environment. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a lot of information, and you're leaving? Well, I hope that when we reach out to everyone, I know a lot of you are transitioning because your transportation is here, that you will partner with us to do the work. because there's a lot of work to be done. Did anyone want to comment, respond to those statements, or anyone have any other questions?
I had a question.
Question right here.
Okay. So my name is Martha Arizona, and I'm NJEA, but I also work at a vocational technical school down in Salem County. Nobody's ever heard of it. It's near Delaware. And we have a very large disparity between the black and brown communities, students of color, and the white communities. And it's mostly like segregation. And so what I'm asking is, you were, Dr. Payne? You were saying something about organizing. How do we organize those communities so that the teachers, like Carmen Porter and I, can actually advocate not only for the students, but for the community as well?
That was right up my alley there. Because I wanted to talk about that before I go. First of all, I had an aunt, Grace Plater, who taught in Plainfield schools near the end of her career. She taught in Newark before that. Every place she went, she organized a concerned parents group, right? She's a teacher now, right? But she understood there are some parents that don't have enough confidence to go up and challenge what professionals do in school. But if you put them in a group, and there's some professionals in the group, right, then they can be very, very different, right? And so every school, she argued, ought to have that group of concerned parents that look out for everybody's child, right? And that can bring in some other parents who wouldn't be comfortable on their own. So that model has always just seemed to me to be very powerful. Then I want to say two other things about continuing this conversation. I know most of you know about the suit to desegregate New Jersey schools. We expect the Supreme Court to make a decision, or the justice, because I think it's now down to one justice, to make a decision sometime this fall. There have been a number of spin-offs off that. One of them is something that I think, it's a group, some of the same groups that Salvation and Social Justice, the Latino Action Network, NAACP, Urban League, some of the same groups that formed
Black United Agenda.
Black United Agenda. Some of those groups have created a different project involving additional groups around the fundamental question of what should an equity agenda for New Jersey be, right? I mean, from top to bottom, from pre-K through college graduation, what should state policy be, right, if we are really committed to equity? So that group is meeting. We had one conference we thought was very successful in June. We'll probably have one, I believe, on how we improve mathematics instruction for the bottom quartile in the state sometime in the winter. And we'll definitely have a group that will be charged with coming up with recommendations for state policy on discipline disparities, right? Anybody who's interested in either being informed about that group as it develops, or working on that group even better, right? And your charge again, right, is to come through the next couple of months to visit some of the places that are doing well and to come up with some policies that we as a group can fight for. So we have a sign-up sheet. Anybody who's interested in that, please just sign it. The other thing that I want to say, and after this I'm done, is that some of this work has to be done at the local level. It can't all come from the state. And the truth is, parents are going to have to step up in a different way, right? They need pushing, they need encouragement, but the parents are going to have to step in a different way. So that one of the things that I would like to think would be possible is that we could form groups of parents, teachers, and concerned citizens in every community that would look at the data on their community. So if your school has certain kinds of disparity, if there are certain classes where certain kids consistently fail, and there are, right? Because you're going to say that about most schools, right? We look at that data together, come up with solutions together, and monitor the implementation of those solutions together, right? And again, if the state can't, that data can be made available at the local level. So anyway, I hope people will think about that kind of activity
And Dr. Gray would like to add, I just also want to add that the Black United Agenda started NJ BIC, and what Reverend Dr. Darrell Armstrong spoke about earlier, the Black Leadership Plan, is also the blueprint for the Black United Agenda.
Thank you. Yes, I was going to add the role of the family and the caregiver, because we also know and see in schools that students, especially in poverty, that are in Black and brown communities, oftentimes are not being reared by their parents. It may be auntie, it may be grandmother. So what Dr. Payne and Dr. Campbell presented in terms of that engagement piece is critical. And how we elevate their voices in a collective is also essential. As a former superintendent that led a school district during the pandemic, one of the opportunities that I was confronted with was the opportunity to have Zoom meetings with families. There's a misconception that Black and brown families are not interested in their children's academic experience. And I used and coined the term opportunity during the pandemic because what I found out with the work of now my acting director for Project Adelante here, Sonia Irisari, is that 6:30 p.m. on Sunday nights was the operative time to meet with my families. That was the time. Now, I would not have known that had I not been in a pandemic. I would not have had a reason to do that. We need to, as a collective, look at spaces and places where we have now identified that we need to have our voices elevated, take advantage of opportunities where we can form these collectives, and then make sure we are receiving proper information. A large part of what is happening here is that we're not accessing accurate information, and we're going along with narratives that have happened for a while. When you were in the pandemic, you had the opportunity to see for yourselves what's happening in the classroom. That was empowering information. You saw it and other families saw it too. So having those critical spaces and places for those conversations. In addition, when you mention communities of practice where you see really positive things happening, there's organizations in those communities that are really supporting great work. Communities are coming together to ensure that students that need laptops have laptops. We were the beneficiary of that from Plainfield Now. Since we mentioned Plainfield, our honorable mayor here and other organizations within that city work in tandem with higher education institutions to see and identify the gap and provide the solution. A narrative where we continue to talk about the problem doesn't get us to effectuating the change. We've identified it. We now know we need to really come together at the grassroots level, have those critical conversations that Dr. Payne and Dr. Campbell have given us the data to support, the why, but also not get too far off the tangent about discipline. Discipline is a factor. Obviously, if you're not there, you cannot learn. However, it does not impact in isolation student learning. And so exposures, externships and internships are key. Finding those corporations and organizations that are willing to take our children and put them in those spaces and places help. Children in poverty may not have families that go into law offices, that go into architectural programs. But if we place them in those spaces and places, it begins to give them a window into a world of possible. So we need to make sure that we are having those conversations, providing that access, exposure, and support, and bundling that with those critical conversations that Dr. Payne and Dr. Campbell have talked about.
Well said, well said. And I'm going to allow, yes, you can applaud that. Absolutely, well said. I mean, applaud all three doctors. This is a wealth of information. I know there's another question, okay? And Dr., let me just say this much, time check, it's beyond 2:30, and we are having another forum in the auditorium. However, I am going to allow Dr. Campbell the question and a 30-second closing remarks. Introduce yourself, please, sir. And who you represent.
Good afternoon, Dr. Payne, This is Shokwa from the New Jersey Department of Corrections. Can you please expand upon social capital and how that is affected by kids being out of school, and how would that affect them in the larger community?
Question. You and I can talk later. I will say this. We had a research meeting at work yesterday, and one of the pieces of research that I referred to there is a body of research which said, from the city of Chicago, at least the part that I know, if you go into Chicago neighborhoods and you ask, do you know your neighbor? If there's a problem, can you and your neighbor solve it? Do you know the name of any pastors in your neighborhood? That is, you're measuring social capital. Is your neighborhood connected? If you find neighborhoods where social capital is high but income is low, crime will be lower and schools will be better. Now, we don't know what the heck those connections are, right? How do you get from, I have confidence in my neighbor, to the kids learn algebra better? We don't know that, right? But it seems to be a very, very firm connection. Social capital is huge. Did anybody want to? And I think one of the things that kids get out of internships, the kind of thing that Dr. Gray mentors, the kind of programs that she was talking about, they get a kind of social capital that other kids get in other ways, right? That's one of the reasons those programs are so important. Thank you.
Rigor, relevance, relationships. We know all about that as teachers.
I just really just wanted to express my excitement about the last point that Dr. Gray mentioned, because I did have a question, which you answered, because you mentioned the work in dual enrollment and internships and things like that, and I just really wanted to raise a connection between curricular and school engagement and reduced exclusionary disciplines. I'm really glad that the conversation is landing here. Thank you.
And we'll transition now to final thoughts. We'll start with you, since you just, Dr. Campbell, then Dr. Payne, and we'll close out, since this is her home, Dr. Gray. 30 seconds, please.
Had final thoughts. Just thank you for an engaging discussion. You know, when you do data, you're in the data and you're seeing the disparities, and I'm really glad that the conversation moved into what can we do, how can we organize. You know, we are the areas for change. So I look forward to the different venues that are being convened in the state for concerned individuals like all of us to really put those ideas forward and move toward changing those numbers. They're very upsetting numbers to think that, you know, black boys, for example, black girls are getting that much less time in the classroom than their peers. So, you know, just looking forward to the action that follows. Thank you.
Yes, and I don't really have a closing statement, but I will piggyback on Van Dien. I would encourage you to look into your local numbers. You can get them, they're on the web. If you can't find them, call us and we'll help you, we'll help you look. But the more discussion there is about the numbers by people who understand the context, the better. Beyond that, just thanks for your interest, thanks for your question, and don't forget to sign up if you're interested in further conversation about this.
In closing, I'm just going to circle back to what I said previously. The data is important, their numbers. We're dealing with people. And I want to just let that rest for a moment, because when we talk about people, it should be the driver for all of the action that takes place after. I don't know if we're out of the pandemic. I'm really still unclear in terms of how we're viewing that, but we learned a lot. And so in closing, I just ask that we not allow us to go back to what was. It can never go back. We have to move forward, and we move forward, and we can move forward because we have new vision, or at least we should have insight now into what should be happening and what needs to happen and how it should happen. And we really need to embrace the collective because we were impacted together. And together we can come out of whatever the ills surrounding this data are. So please, let's not let these lessons go by the wayside.
Thank you. Thank you, audience. Thanks for your attention. Give it up to the doctors, Dr. Payne, Dr. Campbell, and Dr. Gray.